He used to jump out of planes in the past. He is now a high flyer in the banking industry. How has his past shaped his life and leadership?
I'm a former paratrooper, so I jump with the team.
Can an economy thrive on government benefits alone?
We have to change the fiscal picture and have its growth being generated by productivity as opposed to fiscal stimulus.
This third-generation CEO never shied away from betting on himself. From hedge firm acquisitions to reshaping a career by moving to retail banking, he has done it all. With cutting-edge technology, the journey from a shopping cart to the checkout is getting even more cutthroat.
The difference between 30 and 45 seconds could predict whether you're going to buy that product or not.
She was one of the first women to become CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. After serving there for 13 years, now she runs the fastest-growing microcredit institute in the USA. Let's find out how the leader sees and envisions the financial future.
What does it mean being a banker in 2020?
It means many things. First of all, it means dealing with an environment which is a little bit challenging. It means financing the economy and making sure we support our clients. It means working with our team members in order to change our bank, because we live in a world where the change and the evolutions are very rapid.
But how has it changed since the financial crisis? Is it culture or is it the environment?
It's both, actually, but I think the culture has changed quite a lot as well, because the banks are going through a revolution in terms of digitalization, automation, and also because banks have to change in terms of culture and perception. With the financial crisis, bankers cannot be the same. At Unicredit, we say we do the right thing. That's our principle. And that's very important that we change towards ethics and respect, which are two values, to do the right thing with our clients, with our team members, and of course with all the environment.
But who do you do that for? Is it shareholders, your employees, or your customers?
All of them. First is for clients, because it's important that our clients have a bank which does the right thing with them. For employees, to retain them and make sure that they give a sense to what they do. And for new employees to join us, basically. And of course for our shareholders, because the shareholders want a bank which acts properly.
But has the culture really changed, or is it just what chief executives tell us?
The culture changed because it goes down slowly, but I think we have really made a change in terms of how we behave, how we interact with the outside, how we interact with our clients and our team members.
Where does that come from? Does it have to be the job of the chief executive to almost give the DNA of the company and then permeate down all the echelons?
Yeah, it comes from the top. You have to lead by example, first of all, and then each members of the team can buy in, and then we make sure that this spreads everywhere.
Do you spend a lot of your time looking at how you can be less risky and how you can, I guess, engage with clients differently, or do you spend more time trying to figure out how you deal with negative rates?
Well, we do spend a fair amount of time to deal with negative rates. It's marginally on top of our agenda. But more seriously, we spend a lot of time about defining how we can do the right things with the outside and with our team members. It's very, very important today. And it's a matter of leading by example. I made some of my colleagues smile when I changed the car policy of the bank. So I have a Fiat Cinquecento red, because that's the color of the bank, like my tie. That was a symbol that, as a bankers, we do the right thing, and we use the car of everybody to work, and a car which is Italian, because we are a European bank, but headquartered in Italy.
So how many other bankers that work for you now show up in a Fiat 500?
Well, they made sure that the contract of the leasing on their car has been slightly extended, so I'm the only one so far. So the culture will change step by step, basically, once their leasing contract is over.
Is that how you win clients? What do the customers ask of banks?
Well, the customers ask the bank to support them. I finish all my client meetings when I see a corporate client, small or big, and I tell them, you can count on us. And I think that's the most important thing. Clients work with us, but they need to know that if they go through a more difficult patch or if they make a big move, they can count on us. And when you see a client, you look them in the eye and say, you can count on us. It means a lot, actually.
But what happened that banks, in certain instances, actually lost their way? that they almost forgot that they were there to finance the economy instead of, making big money elsewhere?
Well, it happens in the past at a time where maybe the environment, the culture was different. I think today, when you look at the news in politics, in social events, you can see that the banks have to behave properly. And so we are here to finance the economy, small and big client, retail client, high net worth client, small corporate client and big multinational, and any of them is important for us. There's no difference.
Is there anything good that could come out of negative rates? They're better for non-performing loans.
Well, it's good for non-performing loans, as you said, because negative rates are, something which help the economy. So, many people criticize the ECB saying negative rates are bad because they basically, negatively impact the top line of a bank. But at the same time, Mr. Draghi pointed out, and he is right, that negative rates help the European economy to stay at a relatively modest rate of growth, but growth, not recession. So the provision of banks were going down. So net, the banks have been having a decent performance. Maybe now, if they are low or negative for longer, it might have a slightly negative impact on banks. We shall see.
Does tiering help?
It does, but it's a marginal help to a certain extent, and I'm sure the ECB can do more tiering. The tiering is calculated at a multiple, and they could increase the multiple, for instance. It's a call to the ECB to increase the multiple.
Mr. Mustier, when you look at how you can deal with negative rates, you've said that you will pass it on to some of your wealthiest clients. Have you had pushback against that?
Well, we have said that we need to pass the impact of negative rates to the client. For us, for instance, in Italy, it's for 0.1% of our client base. So for 99.9% of the clients, there is no impact. You want to make sure that for clients which are more vulnerable, those which have a deposit under the deposit guarantee level, 100,000 euro, you don't push them to change their allocation because that might be dangerous. But for the clients which have more than 1 million euro deposit, that's the one we're targeting, we decided to, one side, offer them an alternative product, so a money market fund with a target performance of 0+, no commission, so for them it's a shift which is not costing money. And for liquidity in excess of 1 million euro, we discuss with them to see if we can charge them some kind of commission for excess liquidity.
Do you worry that they'd go elsewhere?
Our clients like us, and we make sure that we find an agreement which is mutually beneficial.
You were mentioning the ECB and we were talking about tiering. Well, how would you describe the relationship between European banks and the European Central Bank right now?
It works very well. Everybody says, it's the regulators, how you can deal with them. But in fact, it's a matter with the supervision side, which is where we interact the most. It's a matter of trust. I do interact with the person who is supervising the bank 2 or 3 times a day. We exchange emails, we speak together. So you build trust and you actually can benefit from each other. And the ECB has made a lot of progress on the supervision side. I mean, Mr. Andrea, in his latest speech, thanked Mrs. Nui, who created the ECB. But if you look back in 5 years, they did something super good.
Will we see a banking union in our lifetime?
That's a very important question. Actually, we need to define what is a banking union. So a lot of people say we need to complete the banking union. And some people say, but for that we need to have a European deposit insurance scheme. It's a bit technical to me. For me, a banking union means that we have a banking sector which is seen by investors as a European sector. Let's take an example. In the US, when you speak to a US investor, he's going to say, I invest in a US bank. If you speak to the same investor speaking about Europe, what he or she is going to say. Invest in a German bank, an Italian bank, a French bank. Our sector is not seen as a European sector. So for me, the banking union, it's about making sure we have a strong pan-European banking sector. And why? Because we want to attract capital of investors to buy into the bank capital, debt or equity, to give banks the resources to finance the economy. In Europe, banks finance SMEs, which represent 70% of the job. And SMEs don't go to capital market. So it's important that the banks can finance the economy and attract capital.
But if you don't need this deposit scheme, right, which we've seen the Germans be against, then if you create a European champion, you have that bank that could rival the US.
Well, the banking market in Europe is more fragmented than the US. If you look at the combined capitalization of the top 5 European banks, it's smaller than JPMorgan. So, of course, there's a size impact. Why? Because the US market is one single market with no borders, basically, and the same language or the same rule. While in Europe, it's a bit different. We de facto have 27 market or 70 market in the Eurozone. So what is important is to make sure that we have more unification of rules and that the banks look the same when you look at them from the outside. So the deposit scheme is an important parameter, but not sufficient to make sure that the banking sector look completely uniform.
Since taking over at Unicredit, you got rid of quite a lot of assets. What's your vision for what Unicredit will be like in 5 years?
Well, Unicredit is a pan-European bank, very proudly headquartered in Italy. And Unicredit will be, in 5 years, an even stronger pan-European bank. We call ourselves a pan-European winner. So we want to keep developing our activities in the country where we are, to support the retail client on one side, and to support the SMEs to help them grow domestically and to export, and to make our interaction with them completely smoothless on a multi-channel basis. So the client should have a better client experience. It's already very good, but it will be even better and very smooth. For instance, we are putting in place in Italy soon and in other countries paperless branches. Why?
That's digital. No.
It's digital, but it is paperless in a sense that for the client, the interaction will be super smooth. And for bankers, rather than spending time to write and fill in forms, they will be able to spend more time with our clients. So that does improve as well the interaction with them. So the evolution will be to have a much smoother interaction with the clients.
But how different is that interaction going to be? I know, my parents and the parents before them used to want to go and speak to their bank, or a lot of the new generation don't want to speak to their bank unless something goes wrong.
But they want to speak to their Unicredit bankers. But more seriously, the interaction needs to be multi-channel. You don't go to a branch today. You do all your transactions on your mobile, on your iPad. But from time to time, for important transactions, you need to speak to somebody and interact. So this is why we have this multi-channel access where you can have a banker actually calling you for a video conference from your iPad, from your computer, or just on your phone in order to give you advice. And so the interaction will be much more fluid, but you will still, from time to time, rarely, need to have a human interaction.
Talk to me about sustainability. Is it just PR talk, or are you really focused on delivering sustainability for the bank?
I think it is an extremely important topic, and you're right to say that there is a little bit of PR talks on some of the actions which are taken. So some people call that now greenwashing, meaning going maybe a little bit too extreme. It is important to communicate about what we can do, and to show that we are transparent, to measure the actions. That's key. What is very important, something I worked on with the European Banking Federation, of which I'm chairman, and the IIF, the International Institute of Finance, is to see how we can measure on the bank balance sheet what you could call the carbon footprint. Because with sustainability, specifically for climate, there's a lot of emotion. And it's normal. We want to protect the earth. So emotions are very important to raise visibility and awareness about the climate issues. But emotion needs to be canalized to a certain extent to make sure we take the right actions. And to take the right actions, you need to measure. You need to understand if something has more impact than something else. And for the banks, they will be absolutely key in this development because they will finance the change. Green development, but also transition. And when you finance an oil company which uses the money for the transition from oil to green, it is actually useful as well. So measuring is something very important.
But this goes back to transparency and actually how you measure it. Are we measuring right? And are we going to have a European or worldwide standard where you measure things the same way?
Well, that's what we're working on. The European Commission, I'm sure that the UK will adopt similar standard, has issued recently a taxonomy proposal where you can define what are the sustainable sectors, basically. So that's first important to have the right definition. And then what we are doing with the European Banking Federation, the IIF, is to make sure that on the bank balance sheet, with this sustainable sector, you can measure what has been the action of the bank so that we can see if the bank is doing the right thing and financing the right sectors. Without doing that, it's difficult. But measuring is a bit complex because you need to know exactly what is the carbon content, if you want, of a loan. But we are working with academics and we'll make a proposal soon.
The Bank of England, I think, stress tests their banks on climate change. Should we do the same in Europe?
We should do the same. And it's not only about doing the right thing, but it's also looking at the risk. Because, the risks are here every day, probably more for insurance companies now, which can see, for instance, with storm, hurricane, fire, more impact than the banks. But you can have the same impact for the banks soon.
What kind of leader are you? Bank leader. How do you lead?
I'm a former paratrooper, so I jump with the team. And with the team at Unicredit, we did many difficult things and we took a lot of decisive action. We raised a very large amount of capital. We sold a very large amount of non-performing loan, almost 50 billion. And we increased massively the profitability of the bank, more than double the return on equity. But first of all, I think as a leader, I say what I do and I do what I say. With our clients, with our team members and with our shareholders.
But when do you involve others in the decision making, right? So you were a paratrooper, do you have consensus and then you say let's go for it, or do you make a decision and then convince the others that this is the right idea?
It's very important to listen to the team members, and what I do is I ask them to speak. Even the young people and the young team members in a meeting, to listen to their view, encourage them to speak, and encourage them to disagree with me. They might disagree, but I might disagree with them, and then I decide. But I think having different views is very important. If you're just within your certainty and you don't have contradiction, you make mistakes. So it's important to listen, but it's important to decide as well. And from time to time, it is not a consensus.
But how difficult is it to find talent, retain talent, and grow talent?
We have in Unicredit an unbelievable number of very talented people. And, people are talented by nature. What is important is to grow their talent and their ability to flourish within an organization. And so you need to give them confidence. You need to give them a sense that what they do is the right thing. And to attract people, we need to be seen as doing the right thing in terms of behavior, but also in terms of action. I did something in the bank to do that, which might be seen as a detail, but which for me is very important. We developed what we call social banking initiative. And when we engage with our team members, when they extend a loan to a micro entrepreneur who will never access the banking market, but because we have a social loan, which is very special, we can lend them money, even if they could not do before, or to social entrepreneur, our team members feel good. The first time I financed a social enterprise, it was a school, actually, in London. And when I went to the school and I saw the children there, I almost cried. Because as a banker, you never see what you do when you build up, the loans. And there I saw that, I was doing something right. And I felt it's important to pass this message to our team members, you're doing the right thing.
What kind of advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
I would give an advice which is, do what you want to do. Just have pleasure and fun in what you do. Don't think about a career plan. Don't think about the future. Just learn, and when you feel comfortable, just try to learn something else. Go always beyond your comfort zone. And when you do that, you become a better person and a better banker.
Is that what you learned as a paratrooper? Do you think back at those days? Were you ever a legionnaire?
Yeah, I was a paratrooper when I was 20 years old, yes. So,
and you think of that, and is there anything that you remember learning back then that you apply now to your job?
Yes, it's to work with a team, and it's as well to make sure that nothing is impossible, because when you jump out of a plane at 4,000 meters, you feel it's a little bit difficult, but nothing is impossible. And if you're alone in the plane, it's very difficult. When you're with a group of colleagues or crew members, it is much easier. So you learn that it's much easier when you work at a team to do more difficult things.
Do you ever feel like an outsider being a Frenchman in charge of an Italian bank?
Well, I am Italian by heart, so I'm almost Italian. No, not at all. I think our bank is actually a pan-European bank. We have half of our activity in Italy, but 30% in Germany, in Austria, and in Central and Eastern Europe. The language in the bank is broken English. Broken because none of us speak proper English. You can see that with my accent, which is a little bit French. But, and we communicate in English, and we feel that we are part of Unicredit, which is our home.
So you have a corporate mascot, Elket. She's never far away from you. What was the idea behind it, and what has it achieved?
Well, Elket is an important mascot because it's what we call in Italian the porta fortuna. So she brings good luck, which, you always need luck from time to time. And it was the code name of our capital increase. The bankers came and had like Star Wars, Dark, whatever. Said, no, let's take a name that nobody will understand. And one of my colleagues advising us are from Sweden and had a little elk. So we say, we are going to call the plan Elket. So she became the mascot of the bank. And, she's important for everybody because she said that we do important things, but we don't take ourselves seriously. Let me give you a small episode. 6 months ago, I received a mail from one of our cashiers in Puglia. Said, can I send you a picture? I never met her. And I said, of course you can send me a picture. And she sent me a picture of a small Elket she had, because we made small Elkets we give to the team members. And she knitted a red jumper for the Elket, because red is the color of the bank. She gave me the energy and the strength to work with the client every day. I was really touched, actually. So you can see that Elket is helping everybody in the bank. That's really cool.
I feel like we should have her on set, actually.
Elket is here.
She's never far away. And
she's never far away, absolutely. But you have a cousin of Elket, I think.
Oh, we do have a cousin of Elket.
Yes.
Do people really talk about her?
Yes, they do. I mean, she has her site, and I give Elkets to all my clients when they come and visit me. They actually ask for Elket now.
On a really bad day, what do you think about? Is there a motto that you have, or is there something you think about? Maybe an advice that someone gave to you in previously that you kind of bring with you?
Well, on a really bad day, I think that it can only improve, actually. And you have always to look at the positive side of things, basically. As a Frenchman, the glass is always half full, never half empty.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. And we put a little bit more wine to make sure that it can be full, yes.
Is there anything...
the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. They all die, but one has a much better life than the other one. So I want to be an optimist.
Is there anything that leaders, chief executives can teach politicians? And is there anything that politicians can teach chief executives?
Bankers need to remain in their place, basically. We're here to finance the economy. We're not here to have a view about what can be done. To be a politician is much, much more difficult than being a banker. Our business and our job as bankers is relatively simple, basically. To be politicians, to think about the future of a country, to take the right actions is super complex.
I was going to ask you, if I speak to you again in 5 years, where will you be?
At Unicredit, making sure that Unicredit is a true pan-European winner.
Jean-Pierre Mustier, thank you so much.
His father was CEO of a Philadelphia chemicals company. His grandfather, CEO of a retail chain, started in Massachusetts. But when he got his degree in economics from Bowdoin College, he headed to New York and the world of finance. Jes Staley cut his teeth at Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, moving to Latin America and ultimately running Morgan's Brazilian business. After returning to New York and taking on equity capital markets, he made his biggest move at JPMorgan after he took on the struggling private banking division and then got the bank to buy one of the most successful hedge funds around, Glenn Dubin's Highbridge Capital. Now Staley runs his own bank, Barclays, where he's following the strategy he helped put together at JPMorgan, marrying a strong consumer retail business to an international investment bank. But for Jes Staley, it all comes down to loyalty and the bond between the bank and the people who work there.
Let's talk about Barclays.
Yep.
When you took over as CEO of Barclays, you had a plan that you've pretty systematically implemented. And as I understand it, simply put, that is marry a very strong retail base with a really powerful international investment bank. Why is that the right plan?
We came in and announced this transatlantic consumer wholesale model for Barclays in March of 2016. And really it was informed by a number of events that I've experienced in the banking industry in the last close to 40 years. And one of the most impactful moments, I think, for almost anyone in finance over the last couple of decades was the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. I was on the operating committee of JPMorgan Chase. And in many ways, JPMorgan Chase was a very strong contributor to resolving the financial crisis. It took over Bear Stearns. And also, I think that bank came out of the financial crisis perhaps in a stronger position than almost any other major financial institution. And to me, the reason for that is because Morgan was a universal bank. It had a consumer bank and it had an investment bank. And we saw between 2008 and 2009 the value of that diversification. Morgan's investment bank lost $24 billion in 2008. The bank made money every quarter because the consumer bank had actually a pretty good year. Then our credit card business in 2009 lost close to $30 billion. And again, Morgan made money every quarter because the investment bank had a record year that year. And that balance of having a consumer business and a wholesale business, I think, is a diversification benefit that if you're running a large financial institution, you have a responsibility to keep, if not build. And the irony, what came out of the financial crisis is the U.S. regulators generally wanted to create universal banks. So they put Merrill Lynch together with Bank of America. When you look at Barclays, we have a tremendously strong consumer presence in the 5th largest economy in the world, in the United Kingdom, and we have a global bulge bracket bank really anchored in New York and London. So that has that balance and that diversification that I think we have a responsibility as leaders of a major financial institution to use that diversification to decrease the risk of the bank. So when there is the next financial crisis, and there will be one, we have a balanced portfolio that will make Barclays hopefully a safe harbor.
One of the reasons why some banks have pulled back some in the investment banking area is risk. How do you manage that growth, that goal of really establishing yourself as an investment bank while not running risk that is beyond what you want to handle? And let me be very specific. You take a look at Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank has had problem after problem after problem. Simply put, how does Barclays make sure you don't turn into a Deutsche Bank?
Well, I'll leave Deutsche Bank aside. The first telephone call I made when I was offered the opportunity to lead Barclays was to a guy named C.S. Venkat and asked him to become the chief risk officer for Barclays. And so one thing I would say is have a very good head of risk. But the other thing is, and I think the market is somewhat missing this, investment banking has changed a lot pre-crisis versus now. And when we created the non-core part of Barclays, which were the assets that we wanted to close down, essentially what we did was we took every single derivative contract written in the bank prior to 2014 into that non-core pool and closed it by June of 2017 last year. So our portfolio right now is really a portfolio constructed with the new capital and regulatory environment that we faced post the financial crisis. You go into 2006, 2007, Barclays had 4% of capital against the total risk-weighted assets in the bank. Today it's 13. So we are well over 3 times the amount of capital we have against the assets on our balance sheet. Moreover than that, if you go back to 2006, 2007, things like AAA securities, even if they were made up of subprime mortgages, had 0 risk. So you had no capital against it. So it wasn't even a risk-weighted asset. Today, with a modern bank, everything is a risk. We turn the lights on and we have a risk-weighted asset, even though it's not an asset. So the amount of capital is more than 3 times higher. The calculation of risk is much greater than it was pre-financial crisis. And these banks, in many ways, are sort of bulletproof. And then you take the fact that the Volcker rule has had a deep impact on the amount of assets that are held on your balance sheet. By closing that non-core portfolio, which were the legacy assets in June of 2017, I think that's really when we significantly de-risked Barclays.
Did Congress and the Fed, regulators in general, do the big banks such as Barclays a favor in actually imposing some of the limitations?
Yes. I am one of those that believes that the banks were in large part responsible for one of the worst economic crises that you and I have ever lived through. And I think risk got out of control. I think banks got in front of the regulators. There wasn't a collaborative interchange, I think, necessary for the regulators to fully understand what the banks were doing. Today we meet with the Bank of England 3-4 times a week. The understanding that the PRA and the Bank of England have about the risk in our bank, whether it's the credit card portfolio or the mortgage portfolio or the trading desk on the investment bank, there's an exchange of information that would have been unheard of going pre-crisis. I think that's very healthy.
You've strengthened the Barclays balance sheet by a lot over the last 18 months or so.
Right.
How are you making a decision about how to deploy that capital? Because it strikes me there are at least two decisions you make. One is I can put more capital against the investment bank, ramp up the investment bank more, put more at risk that way, or I can give it back to the shareholders. How do you make that decision, what you do with that capital?
I think right now almost all the major financial institutions sort of have a covenant with their shareholders that by and large most excess capital being generated should be returned to shareholders. If you take the 5 large U.S. banks, all of them are returning roughly 100%, if not more, of earnings to shareholders in dividends and stock buybacks. We've asked for our shareholders to go through quite a journey over the last couple of years, whether it's paying conduct charges or restructuring charges. So this year, we increased how much we return to our shareholders, both in dividend and buying preferred stock, from £500 million last year to £1.8 billion this year. And as we continue to generate earnings clear of litigation challenges and whatnot, I think you'll see most of that excess earnings go back to shareholders in terms of dividends and buybacks.
We've proven, if we needed to prove it, that if you take central banks and pump trillions of dollars and euros and yen into the market, you can get growth. And we've proven just in the United States, if you take $1.5 trillion and give it in tax cuts and spending, you can get growth. Is there another way to get growth? Because as you suggest, we can't keep doing that. We can't keep growing balance sheets forever. Central banks. Okay, how do you get productivity?
Well, I think one of the great mysteries of the current economic era is where's productivity gone, particularly given the impact that we all see every day around technology. And I think that is probably the great economic mystery that we need to understand, and hopefully we do over time. But ultimately, healthy economic growth is driven by productivity, and you would think that the investment in technology, the positives of globalization, that we would be seeing more productivity than we're seeing, and so the growth wouldn't be so dependent upon easy monetary policy or tax cuts. I mean, in the United States, one of the things we all have to recognize is this is one of the first time in modern economic history where the government debt to GDP is growing, even though the GDP is growing at a very strong rate. That hasn't happened before. That means at some point we have to change the fiscal picture for the U.S. economy and have its growth being generated by productivity as opposed to fiscal stimulus.
If we listen to Mr. Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, a solution to the productivity problem is not Brexit, at least not a disruptive Brexit. I think it's fair to say we have some projections in case of I think disorganized, I think he said, exit.
Yeah.
What do you make of those? Do you agree with them? Are they overly negative? I mean, it's an 8% reduction in GDP, a 25% reduction of the pound. They were pretty dire.
If there is a real hard Brexit, where there is not an understanding between the European Union and the UK on an orderly separation of the rules of trade, I think the governor, while it's very hard to predict, I think that's as good of an estimate as what might happen. I think you're seeing it in where the sterling is trading.
As CEO of a major bank, how do you plan for that? Do you have to plan for a so-called hard Brexit no matter what? Because you can hope for something better, but you can't guarantee it.
Yeah, the Sunday after the referendum vote, which was on a Thursday, the whole executive committee met for the whole Sunday, preparing for a hard Brexit almost 2 years ago. So we've been, hoping for an organized separation, but we've been preparing for a very hard one. We had a bank subsidiary in Ireland. What we did is we significantly expanded the capacity of that bank subsidiary in Dublin. We're in the process right now, almost done, with relicensing all of our branches in Europe, from Frankfurt to Milan to Madrid. as branches of our bank in London to branches of our bank in Dublin. It's about 1,200 people. So we'll move 1,200 people from a British bank to a European bank without moving a single body.
Putting the United Kingdom to one side, if we could for a moment, let's talk about continental Europe.
I don't think I've ever seen a time, for sure post the Cold War, where geopolitics might be having such an impact on economics. We started this year with economic growth in almost every corner, from China to Europe to the U.S. For sure, and there are breakages in that right now. And clearly economic growth is slowing in Europe, slowing in the UK, slowing in China. And I think that will just sort of fuel some of the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing in Europe, in Asia, and in the U.S.
And China is particularly important in that sentence because it has been disproportionately the contributor to global growth. It's been contributing most of it. And it's slowing down some. You have to expect it to slow down. It can't go at the same rate. How concerned should we be with China as an engine for global growth going forward?
I think that, in addition to this issue of productivity, I think perhaps the other great question is China. And I remember when I first got into finance, everyone was talking about Japan. And Japan went from a destroyed economy post the Second World War to become the second largest economy in a pretty quick period of time. And everyone thought that Japan had sort of solved the formula and was just off and would leave the rest of us behind. What also happened with that economic growth is they became the most indebted country in the world. And for the last 30 years, we've seen fairly stagnant growth out of Japan. You also have demographics in there. China comes out of the Mao Zedong era, no debt, and roars this economy up in a reasonably controlled fashion, somewhat like Japan, and now it becomes the second largest economy in the world, and a major innovator in things like technology and whatnot. And so, what will happen? Is it sustainable? They have used a lot of debt to get there as well, and in a country that perhaps doesn't have the full transparency that we would all like to see, I do think it's a question mark. But you travel to China, which I've done a lot. It is extraordinary what's going on in that country. One surely hopes that it is for real. With that population, I think having strong economic growth, the build out of a middle class will be healthy for everybody. But it's a big question mark.
What makes Jes Staley, at least the banker that he is today? You're identified often with asset management and hybrid capital as a big move that you made, which was not universally seen as the right way to go. It was somewhat contrarian. What led to that decision?
When you set the strategy of a bank going forward, every now and then, if part of your strategy is a contrarian move, and you get lucky or get right, being a contrarian is a very powerful place to be in. And we came in to run JPMorgan Asset Management in around 2001, and Morgan's asset management business was struggling. And I went to a conference of asset managers, CEOs like Rathberg from Capital and whatnot, and they actually got 9 of us together in the room. And they said, let's talk about what's going on in finance or in asset management. And that was right after the dot-com bubble. And to a CEO there, they said they thought that the hedge fund industry was a bubble, that 2 and 20 was an unsustainable revenue model, that shorting stocks was unethical. You couldn't act as a fiduciary with a long portfolio if you were shorting stocks on the other side. I left that conference and I said, what if they're wrong? What if the hedge fund industry actually is a very significant transformation in the investment management business? And so a year later, we did the largest acquisition ever of a hedge fund with Highbridge Capital from Glenn Dubin. And I thought it was transformative for the quality of JPMorgan Asset Management and how that business evolved in the years following. But I think over my career, one, I've always seen financial crises. They come. My first role or my first job out of college was working in Latin America, and I went down to Brazil, and that was the place you wanted to be, and the banks were funding dams and steel mills, and a very famous banker named Walter Westin said that sovereigns can't go bust. And I was sitting in São Paulo, Brazil, in the fall of 1982, and the whole bloody continent went bankrupt. And you learn through that, and it took about 4 years for Latin America to come out of its deep darkness. So I think finance is so dynamic, and it changes, and there are risks. And so I think what you need to do is, when times are good, always keep in the back of your mind, it's not going to last. And also, in the depths of financial downturns like we saw in 2008 and 2009, don't lose faith, because doing the right things and working together, we can reestablish things in the financial markets, and that's what's happened.
Success in retrospect always looks easy. At the time, it's not quite so easy. Go back to when you did the Highbridge Capital deal. Were there moments where you had doubts? What were your biggest risks as you did it? Because it was, among other things, putting together two very different cultures.
One of the main risks in that deal was, I remember when we took it to the board of Morgan to get approved, one of the directors said, "Jes, I'm really leaning to not voting in favor of this acquisition." And what's ironic about that is I have a lot of my own money with Highbridge. But the reason is because my view is, the best asset managers, the best portfolios in the world, which you find in hedge funds today, they won't work for a big bank. And I took that to heart, and I realized that, what makes an asset management business are the portfolio managers which drive alpha. So right after that acquisition, I moved my office straight into the offices of Highbridge and spent all my time with those portfolio managers, trying to make sure that we had the right dynamics, so they wanted to stay part of JPMorgan, so we could keep those portfolio managers that was managing our board of directors' investments.
You can keep people happy if you tell them yes all the time. And it's fine to say we're going to have Glenn Dubin play by a different set of rules than regular employees do. At the same time, you also have to make sure you're managing them, that they're not taking risks that you don't want to take, that they're not putting the overall company at risk. How do you strike that balance?
Well, clearly you cannot say yes all the time, but I think loyalty begets loyalty. One of the best conferences I think that I get to go to every year is the Bill Gates Microsoft conference out in Seattle. And a couple years ago, they had a group of millennials on stage talking about their world and their lives. And there were two women that had started a tech company. And they said something that really, really struck me. They said, we think that most of the people in the audience, and they were all CEOs and mostly older men, that you think that we aren't loyal. They said, we think it's the opposite. We think who lacks the loyalty are the major corporations. Remember, we grew up during the 2001 recession, the financial crisis of 2008. We know many of us, if not most of us, had a parent laid off. We grew up where a factory in Rochester, New York got moved to Mexico on a weekend and it was over. And the truth is, one reason why we like startups is because if you're a founder, I get to keep my job. And there's actually a stability towards it. If I could do one thing, when I leave, it would be to plant a conviction in the employees of Barclays that this institution is very loyal to them.
What setback or mistake have you had that you've learned the most from?
Sort of I characterize it as a mistake, but one of the interesting things in my career is a number of moves I've made on the face of it looked like they were big reversals. I spent the first decade of my career working in Latin America, lived in Sao Paulo for 8 years. And basically, my wife agreed that I'd try to be a banker in New York and not just a banker in Sao Paulo. And so I went to Morgan, and at that time I was pretty much running the bank in Brazil. And the bank said, well, there's really no job for you here in the U.S. But we had enough of a relationship where the bank said, but if you want to come, we'll give you a desk and see if you can find something to do here in New York. And Latin America was on the resurgency again, so I knew I could go back to Latin America if I wanted to. So I packed up the family, moved to New York, and got a desk. And spent about 3 months before I knew what my next job was going to be. And it was at the time where Dennis Weatherstone wanted to get into the capital markets, and they gave me the ability to build a convertible bond desk, and I didn't even know what a convertible bond was. But taking that risk paid off in a very big way. And then 10 years later, I was one of basically 3 people running Morgan's global equities business, which by that time was quite strong. And I was doing all the underwriting, syndicate and equity capital markets. And I got a call from the then CEO, Sandy Warner, saying, Jes, we have a private bank in Midtown. It's losing money, it's losing clients, and it's losing people. You're one of our rainmakers in the equities business and in the investment bank. But let me tell you, there are some people who believe that you can't manage people. So here's an opportunity. Why don't you go run the private bank and see what you can do managing people? And at that time, going from being a big deal maker in the investment bank to go and running a private bank, that was as much of a demotion as one could take. But it was my compensation was reduced. Again, the whole visibility was much less. But it was an opportunity to see whether I could manage people of some scale. Face an incredibly challenge. That private bank was probably in a really structurally and strategically bad place. So that was another step back down, but I think ultimately learned a lot from it. That morphed into the asset management business and then went back to the investment bank. So sometimes you got to take a couple steps backwards to reset and then move forward again.
That's great. Thank you so much. She was born in Canada to parents who'd come from China, and they made sure that she learned Mandarin along with English, while never forgetting her Chinese heritage. After Princeton, Andrea Jung began a life in retail, rising through the ranks of Neiman Marcus and Bloomingdale's, ultimately taking over as CEO of a troubled Avon Products, where she turned the company around by expanding internationally and focusing on empowering the 6 million women selling its products worldwide. One of the first women to serve as CEO of a Fortune 500 company, she remains the longest-serving woman to this day. Currently, Jung sits on the boards of Apple and Unilever, and she's taken on a new challenge. Chosen by Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus to be CEO of Grameen America, where she's already distributed more than $750 million in microloans to nearly 100,000 less fortunate women, continuing her quest to ensure that women have every opportunity to succeed and to lead. Welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions. Great to have you here.
It's great to be here with you, David.
You've spent much of your career in consumer retail business. What drew you to that?
It's an interesting thing. I got out of college, and I thought I wanted to be a journalist, and that didn't pan out, so I went into a training program in merchandising at Bloomingdale's in those days and worked my way up and had a passion for brands, for merchandising, and that led me through a pretty long career all the way up to Avon. So having spent that much time at very, very senior levels, what intrigued you? What made it really that interesting you worked that long on it and that hard? I think it really all came together for me when I got to Avon. And I joined in a marketing role, a marketing and merchandising role in the North American division. But what really drew me to the brand was actually the essence of it and the purpose of the brand. And I really believe in socially minded, purpose-driven brands. And who wouldn't fall in love with a concept of a company that was founded in 1886 by a prescient man named David H. McConnell, who actually wanted to give women the chance to go selling door to door when all direct sales were men at the time. And this was 34 years before women could vote. So the brand began not only as lipsticks and skin creams, but also as economic empowerment for women, and that drew me to the company and made me extremely passionate about the mission and the cause, as well as the business per se for many years. When you went to Avon at a senior level, people talked about you for the top job, and there came a time that it was open, and you didn't get it, at least right away, but you stayed. Why? Yeah, it was a defining moment. It was at a moment where The company was 99% women Avon ladies. So the sales force was women, our product line was primarily women, and at that time I think there were only maybe 1 or 2 women in the Fortune 500 who were CEOs. And I love the company. I'll never forget that I got a great piece of advice from a mentor who, when I did not get the job, said, follow your compass, not your clock. And I thought, well, I never sort of set out to become the CEO with the final aspiration being the corner office. My aspiration really was be involved with a business and a company that you think does great things. The company was struggling. I felt a great commitment to the team, and so I made the decision to stay. 18 months later, the CEO they did choose didn't stay in the job, and I got the job then. But that's sort of, in hindsight, when I think about it, I still would have made the decision, even if that hadn't been the case, because I love the company and I love the work that I was involved in. And it was the first time that I think it was a life-changing thought for me, not just a professional thought, that you really have to be involved with work that you love. And the title, while nice, it's not the important thing. It's not the be-all and the end-all.
Whether it was a turnaround or not, it certainly was a transformation you set about doing in various ways. I mean, internationally, online, in the way you distribute product, and even in the nature of the product itself.
Absolutely.
Taking it sort of younger and hipper. What was your thinking in doing that?
I think that every brand needs to be transformed, and I think that's a little bit different than turnaround. It is about staying relevant. It's a 120-plus year brand that everybody knew. Everyone knew the Avon lady, everyone knew, but the perception was ding dong, Avon calling. And in some countries it was perceived as, a brand for my grandmother's brand. And we knew back in the early 90s that in order to change that, we had to have the right product, the right packaging, and that marketing and merchandising could make a huge difference, but that, you and I could start a business, and to have that kind of brand recognition and trust in households would be nearly impossible. It had been built over a century. So to take that base and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but look at the channel, look at the mode of distribution, look at the brand and its packaging, all of that had to be changed. So it was a big job, but a fascinating one because everyone loves Avon.
What is the dashboard you use to determine whether you're on course or not?
I think you have to look at, first of all, consumers. And you have to look at where they're shopping, what they're buying, their patterns. There's so much information now. I think that the brilliant thing is that we're so data rich that we can tell that, you, David, if you're looking at something for 30 seconds versus 45 seconds and you're hovering over it and you haven't even put it in your basket, the difference between 30 and 45 seconds could predict whether you're going to buy that product or not. That data wasn't available 5, 10, 20 years ago. And it's extremely powerful. How do you use it in the right way? But add the art of merchandising, not just the science of it. I think that's the very key blend. But I think the metrics that are informed by consumers and data, the wealth of information is boundless right now. And so not that it makes the job easier, no job is easy, but it definitely allows for deeper penetration and very individualized customer targeting.
You have experience at Bloomingdale's, you have experience at Neiman Marcus, other retailers as well. As you look at that e-commerce world right now, what are the possibilities, what are the challenges, the risks for the traditional retailer?
I think if you don't embrace it, it's a huge problem. This is how customers are choosing to spend, and I think you have to look at the next generation and look at those who are aging into the spending years, those who are going into their early 30s and then early 40s, and if you look at just the population and its movement, how have they been shopping? Are they used to going into stores? Are they used to going into malls? And it is clear that we're moving into a generation that wants speed, wants efficiency, wants to get it at home, be able to return it quickly. So I would never bet against e-commerce. It's a huge and important growing role.
But if you're a significant retailer, maybe not the size of a Walmart, but a Neiman Marcus or a Bloomingdale's or something, can you go it alone on e-commerce? Or do you need to go in league with Amazon, put your goods on Amazon? Or is there some other way to sort of combine with other retailers?
I think it's tough to do it alone. I think Walmart, to your point, can do it alone and it's invested. And you have to have the investment power and the thousands of data analytic engineers that you need to really compete in it. So partnership, I think, is important. My own opinion is that partnering is probably a very, very smart way if you have the brands and you have the cachet to partner with the people who've got the supply chain figured out and who've got the infrastructure and the logistics figured out and the analytics.
How much of your being Asian, as you say, Chinese Canadian, really affected your role as a CEO, either for better or worse? How much did that make you a better CEO, or did it get in your way sometimes because you were different?
That's an interesting question because I think it's informed who I am and how I lead. I don't think it so much got in the way as it did inform how I had to act and learn how to lead. I grew up in a very traditional Chinese family. So being sort of aggressive was not how we were trained, not how we sat around the dinner table. And yet I had to become more assertive. So I had a lot of coaching, informal and formal, to become something that I felt was comfortable, but wasn't out of the culture in which I was raised. So I would say that I became far more assertive and had to learn to become much more assertive. Understand that constructive confrontation was healthy and critical as a CEO to get the best out of people around a table, but never become what I would consider type A aggressive and change who I was. Not even so much as a woman, but as an Asian.
You've had the opportunity to serve on some very big, important boards of big, important companies, publicly traded companies. Still do. What, in your experience, distinguishes a successful board from a less successful board?
Two things, David. Trust and independence. I think you get derailed if either of those is broken. Being on boards is a huge responsibility. It's also a huge privilege. And I think that it's a changing role, the role of directors of large corporations today than it was 5, 10, even 20 years ago. I think the role of directors is becoming quite clear that strategy, risk, people, and now culture, I think, are the four things that boards have to do. It's impossible to micromanage a business. That's leadership and management's job. But being a director for large companies, new companies, small companies, it's a privilege, but it's a very big responsibility.
When you take on that responsibility, how do you assess what you're contributing to it? I mean, why are you on the board? I mean, we'll take a specific one just because you're on the Apple board. When you've been on the Apple board for a long time, how do you envision what you bring to it and also what you get from it? What do you take away from the experience?
Well, let me start with the latter first, because it's been an extraordinary privilege to be on the Apple board for the last 10 years. Obviously, it's an extraordinary company with extraordinary leaders, and the learning is just impossible to even begin to express, just as they themselves continue to transform and really approach the future. My feeling, and this is true of Apple and the other boards I've been on, is that of course there are the experiences that one has had that you bring to the table, and everybody's experience is a little bit different, whether it's international or emerging markets or financial or technology. But at the end of the day, I think what's most important is that you are truly able to lead and help management the way they need it. You're not doing, you're not micromanaging, but at the same time you are asking the right questions at the right time in the right way.
You are still fairly rare in being a woman who's run a really big publicly traded company. As a CEO, chairman, and now you're a woman board member on some prominent boards. Why, at this point in time, do we still have relatively few women running big companies?
There's 5% now in the Fortune 500 represented by women CEOs. So 25 women, I believe, are running companies. Almost 20 years ago, when I became the CEO, I think I was third. That rounded down to 0%. So I guess one could say, it's now 5%, but it's 20 years. And so I think we would both agree that that is hardly shattering any ceiling. What I'm optimistic about is that the pipeline is more full. If you look at 20 years ago, when I grew up in the business, the chief HR officer, the communications officer, maybe the marketing officer, but your key roles, your key profit and loss roles, your CFOs, those were mostly held by men. That's really different today in 2018. So I think the pipeline is better. You look at the size of the companies that are being run by these 25 women, and whether it's Ginny at IBM or Indra, who ran an extraordinary job at Pepsi, or Mary Barra. These are predominantly male industries, many of them, and the fact that women have broken through, gives me some optimism. Having said all of that, I think it is up to the pipeline. So I think it's an even playing field, but every slate has to be filled with women. So if you're promoting somebody, if you're hiring and using an outside search firm, I think you've got to refuse it if the slate isn't equally balanced. It doesn't mean the woman has to get the job, but if you're bringing me a slate that isn't half women, don't look at it. And I think that's true for a board member, an outside hire, a promotion. And I think that is a simple but a critical discipline, because the outcome will never get there if the input is wrong, and the input is still wrong.
In your time of business, has the paradigm for a CEO shifted toward you? In the sense that if you go back a generation, the really big, brash, bold, dominant male, typically CEO, is what is brought to mind. Has that paradigm shifted?
I think the paradigm is shifting, as we speak. I think that the new competencies and value systems of leaders are under a microscope. So empathy, huge listening skills, the ability to be extraordinarily self-aware, zero hubris. These are really important, critical skills right now that, if not embodied, I think it's game, set, match. And I think you've got employees and customers who are loud, and rightly so, in a very different way than they were even 10 years ago. And I think that in that world, there are different leadership requirements, leadership in every dimension, but including in business.
Are the boards that you're aware of, that you serve on or otherwise, are they taking a proper role in insisting with management that they make sure they have a pipeline that has women ready to move in?
Well, I'm lucky. The boards that I'm on right now, Apple and Unilever, they do a brilliant job. Both run by great male CEOs, but very insistent on making sure that women are a part of the pipeline. The statistics, though, if I move out of these two boards, validates what you just said. Do we? But the question for me is, do we need to have a woman CEO to make sure that the pipeline is full? I say not. This mantle of making sure there's equal representation cannot be done by women alone. This is men and women leaders have to understand the case for it, the business case for it. I was fortunate to be on a European board to give me some vantage point that was slightly different than what I went in with. So I would not have been for quotas or legislation. If you had asked me several years ago, do we need to use the stick versus the carrot? I would have said, well, aren't we past that in 2015? But I joined the Daimler Mercedes-Benz board. So we're in Germany, in a very male-dominated industry. But I think between the EU legislation and the commitment in Germany itself, what was a glacial pace for women in management as well as women on boards accelerated very quickly to 30%. And it changed a little bit of my lens. I am optimistic. I think we're hitting an inflection point. There'll be, 2 steps back and 1 forward, and not every law is going to be perfect, and it will be complicated. But these are important things, whether it is equal pay, whether it is legislated women on boards. You look at the consumers. When you look in the auto industry, 80% of a lot of the passenger car decisions are being made by the women in the house. So there's a business reason, and the case has been made over and over again. So now it's not about should we do it, it's how do we do it, who's going to do it, and men have to be a part of this, not just women.
You've gone on to run Grameen America. First of all, explain to us what Grameen America is and what does it do?
I feel really privileged to run Grameen America. It's the fastest growing microfinance organization in the United States. We give loans to women and their families who are in poverty in today 14 cities, 21 locations, and they range from New York and our backyard right here in Queens all the way to East LA, Charlotte, North Carolina, Texas, and we'll be opening in Houston shortly. It's now the fastest growing microfinance program in the United States. We've served over 100,000 women and their families, given out over $1 billion. Secondly, we help them be banked. Half of female-headed households that live in poverty are not banked here in the United States. Hard to believe. And so we think it's important for them to understand the power of asset building. In the United States, just a little bit of savings, $5 a week. I mean, if you don't have $800 in your savings account here in the United States, one health issue, one emergency, and you're back down under the poverty line. So it's been proven that having assets is important, even a little bit a week. So we encourage that. And the third thing we offer is a credit score. And our credit scores are approximately 650 for someone who's come to us and paid back with a good repayment rate for 26 weeks. So just after 6 months, you can have a credit score that's very respectable from no credit or bad credit, and that is life-changing as well. Our women form groups. They meet with their peers every single week, and that model has given them a tremendous amount of empowerment, peer learning, which has really fueled their ability to be successful.
Grameen America is not-for-profit. How does it compare? How is it the same? How is it different from running an Avon, which is very much for-profit?
We do have a 501c3 status, which technically makes it a nonprofit. But what I love about the model is that, in fact, I view it as a social business. It is an opportunity to have a model that, in fact, can make a profit. So to give you an example, in our first branch in Queens, New York, we will generate close to $2 million of profit from that branch after 10 years. Now that money isn't going to shareholders. It's going back into the program. It's going back into fueling more entrepreneurs. It's going into helping us fuel our Harlem branch. So the cycle of the profits is a positive thing, but we have a sustainable model, a sustainable economic model, and that makes it scalable.
You mentioned it's women and their families. Going back to Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus addressed women.
Yes.
Why women? Why do the loans all go to women?
Women are disproportionately affected in terms of financial inclusion. Just if I go back to Bangladesh in the early days before Professor Yunus started the program, if you were a woman in Bangladesh and you went to the bank to get a loan, they would say, come back with your husband. Women were absolutely not given loans. So you had half of the population not participating at all in the economy. And as an economist, his deep belief was that there's no way for this country, which was at that time one of the poorest countries on earth, to ever move its way up and fulfill its sustainable development goals if half the population was excluded. So the thought was to be able to give loan capital to women. And in the very early days, it was, not easy. They actually went out into villages with small loans, and some of the women would say, don't give the money to me, give it to my husband. I don't really understand the language of finance. But I think the extraordinarily visionary and powerful thing is that they went back and said, no, that's history speaking. But there is no reason that you can't be as successful an entrepreneur as anybody else. And you can be a farmer or run a business just like your husband. And that now, 40 plus years later, has proven itself out to millions and millions of women. You've
made a lot of decisions over the course of your career. And I wonder if there are any that you made that you were wrong about. Wrong in this sense, either you went into it reluctantly, thinking it wouldn't work, and in fact it worked wonderfully to your surprise. Or on the flip side, you were sure it was going to be a good thing, and it actually didn't turn out as good.
Oh, so many, David. We don't have the hours here together. I think, I think you have to have a huge level of self-awareness and humility when you're in these jobs. Without that, I think that it's very easy to, when you are in that corner office, not hear from other people, have people reticent to tell you you're not doing the right thing. And I think you've got to work really hard at it and acknowledge and understand when you've made, either strategic mistakes, people mistakes. Of course, I wish I could have do-overs on many of them. And luckily, over time, I've made more right decisions than not. And that's what we all want to do. But I think the most important thing is to say, you know what, I've got to learn from that. The job changes so much. I came into CEOship in 1999, then there was Sarbanes-Oxley, and the job itself, compared to my predecessors, was a completely different job. Today, it's even different than, when I retired from the Avon job in 2012. So I think that in that, the skills you have as a leader, which may get you through the next year, I could argue that it's going so quickly at this point, it may only get you through the next 6 months. If you don't reinvent yourself, take a stark and humble look at the mistakes that you've made and how to reinvent yourself first, because you can't reinvent a company. You can't transform a brand if you don't transform yourself.
Andrea, Jung, thank you so much. It's been really
Thanks
great.
a lot, David. It's been great to be with you.